will talk about today quality management and evaluation in PCVE and how to create the best learning environment. This is a very important topic since European countries are implementing PCVE strategies, action plans and interventions. And quality management and evaluation is essential in order to make grounded statements on the effectiveness of these interventions, to create a learning environment and improve working methods. However, implementing quality management and evaluation into the work routine and their daily practice is not always easy. It can be challenging. It requires collaboration between practitioners and academics. You have the complex nature of PCVE work and the target group it addresses, multiple parties involved. Can make it challenging. And therefore, we are very happy that we have today three very interesting speakers talking about this topic. We will start with a presentation by Paulo Teixeira, followed by a Q&A session. Then we have a presentation by Julian, also followed by a Q&A session. And last but not least, Liesbeth van der Heijden, and her presentation will also be followed by a Q&A session and a discussion.
And without further ado, let's go to the first presenter of today. That's Paulo Teixeira from Portugal. He's an expert in the field of quality management. And he's the CEO of Logframe, his own company, and also an expert within the RAN expert pool. He's lots of experience in doing evaluative research himself, but also in kind of raising the bar and setting standards for evaluation work. So Paulo, please share your story with us. I will make you presenter now, so you'll be able to share your screen.
Thank you, Rick. First of all, it's nice to be here, and it's nice to discuss these topics as they are for interests to me, and I work in this field for such a long time that it's always nice to have the opportunity to speak about those and to discuss these topics with others that are interested as well. I will share my small presentation now, and I hope it's working okay. So these topics of quality management and evaluation, for sure, there are lots of connections and proximities between those, and I will try to address this both in my short presentation. The thing is, when we talk about quality management, most of the times we are referring ourselves to the use of standards and guidelines that in a way guarantee that the work being done is both in line with the knowledge that is available at the time, the best knowledge that's available at the time, but also that we work in the same way inside a project or a program or an organization, and also that we are working respecting our principles and ethical standards and stuff like that. And so in a way, quality management tries to have to get the pulse of the things that are being done, and the way that we are doing it is that right one, or at least the one that was defined as the right one for us. And when I think about evaluation, it's something that works on those lines, but it's very much focused on efficiency and effectiveness. So it's, in a way, we are seeing if the work is done the way it was defined to be done, but then we must assess if there was change, and if we are working for the changes we wanted to achieve. And this is part of the reason why I said both these are very well connected, and I hope I don't step on what my colleagues in the panel are going to say next, but What I would say is that it's important to have standards and guidelines in this kind of work. And only with standards and guidelines, and by doing work in a certain way, and that we are sure that everybody is working on the same page, we are able to maximize the chances of success. And when we talk about quality management, another point that I wanted to address is that I think that when we talk about monitoring and evaluation and quality management is very much connected with monitoring systems. So the process and the way we look and control the processes is very important for quality management, of course, but also for monitoring systems. So to have some connection between these two systems, and we are talking all the time about systems that are set in place to help management. In a way, it's important to have this very much in our head when we talk about these things, because these systems must be useful for management and for taking options and making selections about what we should do next and what we should do at a strategical dimension, and also in a very pragmatic one, a very operational one. So having these systems working together, it's very important to have continuous improvement in CVE work, I think. And the connections is that if we have a robust process set in place, aligned with the methodological and ethical principles, and supported on research knowledge on these topics, it's easier to define evaluation questions, to define good references for the evaluations. And then if we have good questions, it's easier also with good processes and with processes that are very well defined to choose good relevant indicators, and also to collect them, to have access to the relevant data to answer evaluative questions. And if we do that, of course, we will, in the end, have better evaluation designs, better data quality, better conclusions, and useful recommendations. Because when we are working in evaluations, most of the problems we have are with the quality of data, accessibility to data, of course, and that the data was collected in the same way. So having standardized processes, having a way of doing things will certainly help us when doing and designing evaluations in this area. And one thing that we always want is tools. The question about methods and tools is always here, because we are always looking to have some kind of instruments that can help us. And I think that having technical guidelines for key processes and checklists to ensure standardized practices sure are something that I would advocate for. But to have also reflective practices where you look at what is being done, and having people working with teams, for instances, and having some kind of supervising role to guarantee that the standards are being set in place and that people are using the guidelines is also important. So having this as a regular activity inside projects and inside PCVE activities, for me, it's one of the things that I would advocate for. And having quality management systems, it doesn't have to be something that you certified. You don't have to go for ISO or something like that, but having quality management system set in place and reflect on it, revise it periodically, and see if it's working or not. And so in this way, you can have then design evaluations that can be more process or outcomes or oriented, and some things like theories of change, project programs or project logic models can also help us focus on change. That I think it's one of the most common mistakes we see. And if we are talking about change, of course, we can be looking at change at different levels, like attitudes, then practices and behaviors and activities, and then relationships and social networks, of course. And continuing on this discussion about tools, and please, Rick, give me a sign when I have 3 minutes or something like that. There is no magic bullet. There is no magic tool or instrument that will solve these issues. These are complicated, complex issues. And it would be an hyper-simplification of the reality to, in a way, say to you that the problems we are dealing in PCVE are complex, and then having one tool or one instrument or a small set of instruments that would give us the solution or the response to all these challenges. So what I see is that we can have a process, and there are certain steps that certainly are, at least in my opinion, are good guidelines to develop good evaluation designs. And for sure, defining the purpose of the evaluation, and then determining the scope of this evaluation, and then set clear objectives and develop questions. Sometimes people forget that if you look at it and if you just put aside all the noise surrounding it, evaluations are about answering questions, questions for someone that is asking them, even if they are not very clear at the time. But when you start an evaluation, it's because someone wants to know something about what is happening. So be very clear to have questions that, if answered correctly, can answer to those objectives that you just set. And then choose indicators and metrics, and of course, set the evaluation approach on a plan. So what I would say is that, and I'm focusing myself more in evaluation because that's where...
Okay. 2 or 3 minutes, yeah.
Okay, that's okay. I would say that these are the concrete steps that you have to go. And when you look at designs, you have, of course, some choices. The most common ones are looking back at interventions when they are already done and have some retrospective reflection about those, having some pre and post evaluation and compare the situations, some longitudinal studies and case analysis, of course, using comparison groups sometimes, which is harder most of the times, and even harder having RCTs, which usually pose various ethical and methodological problems as well as resource ones. Just to finish and to not go over the time that I have, I would say that there are some key thoughts and tips that I want to leave you with. The first one is develop a shared understanding of PCVE interventions and evaluations, their objectives, and what success means. And this is key for me because sometimes it's not, even the most basic concepts are not clear, and this is where research, in my opinion, plays a very important role. Also, have quality management system set in place that guarantees standardized processes and that the interventions are making good use of the methodological and ethical guidelines that are set in place. Also, focus M&E on change and not on what is done, because sometimes you see evaluations getting a lot of data on activities and what is being done, but not about what's changing. So the so what questions, I think are very important. So maybe when you are thinking about evaluation, think about, okay, I'm doing this and that, but so what? What changes for these people or in the system that I'm trying to influence? Adapt the methodological options to your capacities, knowledge, and resources available, because sometimes people want to do too much with the resources they have set in place and the knowledge that they have in their teams. And use, of course, both quantitative and qualitative data. And finally, but not less important, the use of storytelling approaches and case studies, as well as data visualization strategies, are important to give context and facilitate communication in the preparation of evaluation results. And I think this is very important, because in the end, you want to have systems that propel action. And if nobody understands the key messages on your reporting strategy, evaluation is just a technical exercise with no added value at the end. So, thank you.
But let me now introduce Julian Yoon. He's the head of the research group on radicalization at the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt, and the project leader for the PREVAL project. PREVAL is a collaborative project funded by the German Federal Ministry of the Interior, aimed at strengthening quality management structures in German PCVE work. So please share your experiences from Germany with us, Julian. Give you the floor.
Thanks so much. Can you see the slides? Good.
Yes, good.
Good to be back with Ran. Thanks for having the possibility to speak to such an international and diverse group. It's difficult to speak after Paolo, because so experienced and touched already on so many points. So I will echo him in my words, and I will put a bit more focus on perhaps some ambivalences and some opportunities in quality management. Rick just outlined already that I'm speaking now a bit from the background of a larger research project. So there's a big team behind me that you can't see, but they had compiled now, we are about to publish 11 studies on many of these issues we are talking today about. Basically, we were focusing on evaluation, but all the time, data management, reporting, monitoring, quality management, were simmering issues in the background, which are important, and I want to talk about that today. There's one link, preval.hsfk.de. There will be the studies available for all of you from now on, but in February, all of them will be available. When we had a couple of parts of this project, but there are two lessons I want to focus on, in particular, as a starting point. First of all, we asked almost all practitioners in PVE, CVE in Germany about their needs and capacity for evaluation and quality management in Germany throughout the years. And there are a couple of lessons from that. First of all, actually, despite some rumors, there is no wide general evaluation fatigue or rejection among those, but we have a highly professional field of practitioners, but they demand certain types of evaluation that are meeting their needs. Need to learn, to adapt, to change, and not necessary to be accountable to grant givers all the time. So there is a particular need for participative approaches, for realistic designs, for conditions that need to be met for evaluations to be successful. Paulo and I will talk about that. Clear uptake strategies and access to knowledge. So these are demands that are not met completely. But what was often there is a confusion between quality management and evaluation experience, because when we ask them, what are your evaluation experience? And we asked them which are the standards and approaches you used, there were basic informational indicators mentioned, not always linked to evaluation, but sometimes. So this made us thinking about where to put the difference here and how are the dependencies between those two, evaluation and quality management. Second starting point, we developed in 8 studies with practitioners evaluation designs. Not an easy thing to ask practitioners and assigned researchers to think together what would be a perfect evaluation design for a given need. This took quite a while to have this change of perspective for practitioners, to ask them to think about evaluation, not just to be an object of evaluation. There were, of course, debates about impact orientation of evaluation. Can you measure impact in prevention work and nothing? Of course, there's something that you need to formulate clear needs for learning, but I don't want to focus on that. Just some side results we found here. First, there was a lot of demand to reflect evaluation on the actual working routines, the daily practices of work, of collecting information, of networks around clients, of cooperative settings. So the important daily nitty-gritty stuff, and not always the big impact stories. Second point is that it is a recurring theme, especially in secondary and tertiary prevention, that there are challenges in accessing and systematizing data in this field. So again, a case for quality management, or to think about that at least. So what follows from that? There's a need for quality management strategies, we think, in basically all PVE, CVE measures. We will collect these thoughts in a planned run ad hoc paper, which hopefully will be published soon, and I will give you an overview of the thoughts we are presenting here today. Paulo said already that quality management and evaluation are somehow intertwined. They are basically often even confused, as I said before. But quality management is distinct from evaluation because it focuses on infrastructure within an organization necessary for it to function, to increase viability, effectiveness, to fulfill its mandate. Quality management can be the necessary input or the output of an evaluation process. Input in the way that an evaluation, of course, harvests new information by interviews and other things, but they rely on existing information too, accessing documentation, case files, meetings, experiences, documentations. So there needs to be a monitoring and reporting system for a good evaluation to work in most instances. It depends, of course, on the question. Secondly, quality management can be subject of evaluation. It can be an output of it. First of all, it can be evaluated. It can be a recommendation out of evaluation, or evaluation can accompany the introduction or the improvement of a quality management system. But it is something different. Very important is that within, for a good quality management system to function, there needs to be a change of culture. We have often a culture in these PVE, CVE measures of retaining information because the sensitivity of the subject, or this case is so unique, our approach is so unique, so why it is so context sensitive, we cannot share experience to other fields. There are limits to that. Practitioners need to create a culture of sharing and exchanging information just because it is necessary to learn. It is necessary even for guaranteeing safety, to understand the challenges of a measure. What are the recommendations for a monitoring and reporting system from that? There are key elements of monitoring and reporting, of course. Key distinction, you need to collect information, harvest information, store data, but as well knowledge. And knowledge is much more than pure information. It is about experiential, so experiences, tacit knowledge, and codified knowledge in terms of what can we learn and how did we process this knowledge. Secondly, every monitoring reporting system should have flexibilities in it to add further documents. There might be new data arising that are not fitting in the categories we did have before. So while I share everything what Paolo said before about standards and indicators, and I will repeat that later on, there are limits to that. There are costs with that to be too rigorous. So there needs to be always a room for flexibility, a room for open categories, a room for new documents and experience to be added. So categories that are used should be specific, measurable, and achievable on the one hand, but there shouldn't be too many of them because then it's getting costly, impractical, they get underused. And in all of our fields we are working on in PVE, CVE, there should be a healthy dose of pragmatism because we cannot adhere to the ideal type. There needs to be a second best option. And just to preserve the trust of the clients, to preserve our work environment, to preserve the safety of our work. Secondly, it is very important that any monitoring reporting system has an organization for validation and participation in it. Take all stakeholders within a measure, within your organization, within the organization entity with you when designing, implementing, and validating quality management systems. This is very important because those are the ones who need to enter information into it and who need to basically live with the consequences of it and the learning experiences from it. Include a space for oral exchange in that. How to document oral exchanges is not easy. Of course, you're codifying it, but there are different ways of doing that. And then I was asked at least to talk a bit, and I will just do it here. It is really important that we create communities of practice. So we have internal oral exchanges, but as well some elements of external exchange with researchers, but as well with networks around clients, informal and formal networks in our work. And then just to echo something what Paolo said before, it is really, really important that there is an uptake and management response strategy in place. And reports, while they might be a necessary evil in that, they might be necessary to have them, they should be only part of it. And Paolo said novels. I'm not as a German, I love some checklists. I would say checklists, have meetings, have interim meetings, feedback loops, and have clear-cut mechanisms that things you learn from an evaluation and from an evaluation on quality management are followed up and implemented. So there need to be an uptake and management response strategy. Now, I would add to Paolo's presentation, but he alluded to that too, that we do have some trade-offs and ambivalences when designing quality management systems as well. So not implementing every rigorous set of categories or indicators help us with dealing with some of these issues. And I would just want to highlight three of them. Designing quality management is not a pure technical process for three reasons. First of all, PVE needs to be context sensitive and has problems with inflexible categorizing systems. You need to keep the right balance between flexibility and rigidity. When we implement and design quality management systems, we tend to go for rigidity. It should be rigid enough for keeping standards sufficiently uniform in order to make comparisons, in order to monitor progress, changes, and practices. There we need some rigidity, sorry for that. But we do need flexibility at the same time. Category systems and input should be flexible enough to adapt to new experience and changing conditions. And in PVE, CVE, we have changing conditions all the time. Political changing conditions, new approaches, innovation in our field, new types of collaboration that RAN or others are fostering change our way of working in these fields. And we as researchers observe these changes all the time. To be able to do so, if you design a quality management system, test it rigorously, your categories, and have clear review mechanisms included, regular ones, quarterly meetings, for instance, to review your categories. And my last slide, the second reason why you shouldn't view quality management as a too technical process is that the data we process in these, we observe to be processed in these PVE, CVE measures is often very sensitive. Of course, with extremisms, we always deal with ideology, religious beliefs, personal beliefs, political views. This cannot be taken out of the picture. It's the core of the work sometimes, not always, sometimes. So we have a especially high bar in coping with data protection requirements here. This sounds utterly boring, but it is utterly important too. And there are ways of dealing with that. And we recommend that everyone needs 4 quality management systems, not in general, but 4 quality management systems in general, 2, a data protection plan that somehow discusses the trade-off between building trust with clients, for instance, which you shouldn't disturb by asking for consent to storing data. I mean, that is probably a mistake you can do in this first. But on the other hand, you need at some point obtain consent. And this strategy needs to be discussed in each of these data protections plans. And then we will discuss in this Rana talk paper a couple of issues that you need to address, how to obtain consent. If you cannot obtain the consent by those you store the data with, you need to discuss the necessity, the appropriateness, and the data economy of the data processed. Third reason why quality management is at least has some ambivalences in and that need to be discussed, and it's not a technical process, is ethics, closely related to the legal issues of the data protection requirements, but there are ethical elements to that, and I think they are important enough to be highlighted as a third point. Adhering to ethical standards is key, and I will just highlight 3 of them I think are of exceptional importance. First of all, confidentiality and transparency. As a researcher, I always say it's important to have transparency. I need to know how your data is collected. I need to know what the data sources are and how it's being processed. But sometimes the effects of disclosing and explaining data collection strategies can be difficult. They could harm the relationship with the clients, for instance. So it need to be very carefully discussed when designing quality management, how to which ends and how far confidentiality and transparency need to be weighed and balanced. Beneficence, so there should be, of course, no harm to clients and participants when designing quality management systems. That is clear. Because of time, I will rush to the last point. Safety and security. Of course, data are a safety and security issue for both the clients and those social workers and others who work with them. There needs to be safe spaces of communication within any quality management system to be able to communicate uneasiness and other things. And there need to be some access point to psychological support purely in terms of monitoring and reporting. I think these are all issues that, of course, deal with all of your work, but shouldn't be reduced to that. They are a point of quality management as well. I leave it there. A lot more to say, but I think this should be a good starting point when thinking about introducing quality management systems. Thank you.
I suggest to move over to the third and last presentation of today. I appoint Lisbeth as a presenter, and I will introduce you, Lisbeth. Welcome. Lisbeth van der Heijden is currently working at the municipality of The Hague. She's the coordinator of the approach to prevention, prevention of polarization and radicalization. In addition, she's also a researcher and a lecturer at the Institute of Security and Global Affairs at the Leiden University in the field of terrorism and counterterrorism and the rehabilitation and also the prison work. Lisbeth, take the floor.
In the meantime, let me get started. Also, thank you very much for having me here today, and glad that I can hopefully add some of my experiences on the local level at the municipality of The Hague to the knowledge that Paulo and Julian have already shared here today. What I want to do is talk basically about 3 things. What does M&E, monitoring and evaluation specifically, look like in practice on the local level? Second, what are, from my experiences as a practitioner, the differences between M&E on the local level versus formal monitoring and evaluation by external academics, for example, and finally, how can we bridge the gap and hopefully, well, I have some ideas about that, some suggestions also from some of my team members, and I'd be very interested to hear how the other speakers or you as the audience think about those ideas. So to start with the next slide, as Rick already said, I work at the municipality of The Hague. And to give you an idea of what we do on the local level, because municipalities, of course, are quite differently organized across different countries. And just to give you a sense of what my background is, so where I'm coming from with what I'm presenting here today, our daily practice, if you can click next, consists of basically 4 things. I have a team of 12 team members. I'm the coordinator of the team, and roughly 4 of them are working on a daily basis on reintegrating individuals that are coming back from prison, coming back from Syria or Iraq, or individuals who have not been arrested or detained, but who we, with our partners, and our partners are, for example, police, general prosecutors, believe to be radicalized. So they are all part of our reintegration approach. So those 4 individuals in my team are basically case managers working with these individuals and with the partners on a daily basis. Then I have a team that is specifically working on contacts with networks in the city, and those networks can both be professional networks but also informal networks. Some examples, we have trained at least 1 individual in all the schools in The Hague on what does radicalization mean, and they have an annual training again in what are changes in the field of radicalization, so that colleagues, for example, can discuss any signs or issues that they might run into with those individuals in school. We also have an enormous amount of religious organization in The Hague, the city of The Hague, over 200, ranging from Jewish synagogues, Christian churches, Hindu temples, mosques. So within my team, we also keep in touch with all those religious organizations, meaning we have group sessions, we organize trainings for them on how to deal with security issues, for example, or how to deal with polarization. Well, I can go on, there's many other networks, but there is all kinds of informal and formal networks that we have a structural relationship with. Then I have 3 people in my team who focus specifically on knowledge and training. One of them is an analyst who creates twice a year just an overview of what's going on in the city when it comes to radicalization based on our own information. So, for example, he's currently quite preoccupied with what do we see in the field of conspiracy theorists, anti-COVID measure sentiments, and so on, and how does that relate to extremism, for example. And finally, I have 2 people who manage a number of prevention projects focused on different audiences, on parents, on schools, students, healthcare professionals. So that's basically what my team members and I do on a daily basis, those 4 things. Then if you go, or if you click next, and another time, when you focus on the concept of quality management, how does that then relate to what we do on a daily basis? From my perspective, when I got started 2.5 years ago, I was thinking, well, it basically comes down to, do we have clear goals and objectives for our overall approach when it comes to preventing and countering extremism, violent extremism? And basically that can be translated into 2 questions. Are we doing the right things? And are we doing those things right? And if you think back to what I just said, those 4 themes that we focus on, that basically means all kinds of questions that we discuss on an annual basis, but also very much on a daily basis with the people who do that work. If you work on reintegrating individuals or sometimes integrating them, what does that then mean? What is the overall goal there? And are we doing that in the right way? And that's something different, for example, from, are we doing the right PVE projects in the city? Do we even know where the main vulnerabilities are? If you look at different parts of the city or different groups in the city. And then if we've identified that, are we doing those projects right? To what extent do we even know that? That's how we view quality management. And then third, monitoring and evaluation in that context. I've come to look at it from basically this perspective, that there is a difference between what we do internal in an informal way, monitoring and evaluation, and what we have going on when it comes to external formal evaluations. And that's what I want to dive into a bit more in the next slide with you, especially that difference between internal and external. When you look at internal monitoring and evaluation, basically, I always say we do that on a daily basis. Every day of the week, I have discussions with my team members. They have discussions with one another on all kinds of questions that have to do with evaluation. For example, or just to give you an example, we have returning women from Syria and Iraq. They are detained in prison and then come back to the cities in the Netherlands, including to our city. We have a lot of policies on paper, national policies. We have our own The Hague plan for returnees. But for example, we were dealing with a first woman with 3 children who were going back to school, and our mayor was quite worried that that would lead to a lot of social unrest in the city. And one of our questions that my team member had, who is the case manager of this particular woman, was to what extent is she allowed to choose a school for her children? Is that something that we play a role in as the municipality? And to what extent, whose responsibility is it to determine whether the school needs to be informed, whether other parents maybe even need to be informed of the background of these children? And that was something that we had not included in our returnee plan. So that's just a very concrete example, I think, of questions that come up as we go along. The other question, for example, more of an overall focus question: to what extent do we think we should include conspiracy thinkers in our reintegration approach, especially if they do not necessarily engage in violent behavior, if they do not pose a threat, but sometimes we see that their followers pose a threat and intimidate politicians. So what does that mean? Should it be part of our approach? Those are just 2 examples of questions that come up through our work and that we discuss amongst ourselves and with other people in the Netherlands, whether it's national policy makers or people from other cities. And this is a process, this internal M&E process, that is going on a continuous basis. It happens on a daily basis, and it's often urgent. We do not have the luxury to think for a year and a half about whether we should do something with conspiracy thinkers or not, or whether this returning woman should choose a school or inform the school or other parents. That's something that needs to be discussed and decided today or tomorrow. If we're lucky, maybe within a month or so, but it's generally always urgent, I'd say. And it's always very political. That doesn't always go for practitioners, but on the local level, I found out that it's just as political as the national level. Basically, the mayor wants to avoid trouble, wants to avoid social unrest, and overall governments don't want to be seen as too soft or too accommodating towards individuals that have been labeled as extremists, while on the other hand, they want to rule out security risks. So there's always that political layer in our work. And if we focus on monitoring and evaluation, it's always phrased in practical language, always very much focused on what are we going to do, whether it's reports that we ourselves write, for example, advice that we give to the mayor or to other professionals in the city. It's always very much focused on concrete actions. Now, if we look at external evaluations, because we've got those as well, on an annual basis, we have about 3 or 4 different external evaluations by Dutch academics, sometimes by Dutch research organizations, sometimes by universities, sometimes even by international research consortia. Sometimes we've ordered them, sometimes they've reached out to us and we thought, hey, that's actually a great idea because we want this to be evaluated. It can be an evaluation of a PVE project. Last year we had an evaluation of our entire reintegration approach. And the difference is that those are generally formalized. They have a very clear research plan. There have been very clear instructions and meetings with the researchers. and there's a clear contract with them that lays out how they will deal with, well, ethical considerations, data collection, and so on. But when you look at the research process, it's not continuous, it's ad hoc, as in generally researchers work on multiple projects. They are not based at the municipality on a daily basis. They come in every once in a while, often it's based on interviews. So in that sense, they have ad hoc access on specific moments into the practice. And often those external monitoring and evaluation projects are much more long-term. A short one would be maybe a 6-month research project, but we also have had projects that run for 2 or even 3 years, which is of course a very big difference with our urgent, informal, daily M&E. That also means that often because of that, because they are not part of the daily practice and because it's a more of a long-term endeavor, it's much less political during the research process, I would say, because often when the research reports are being published, all of a sudden everyone wakes up and looks at, oh, is there anything damaging in this evaluation and how are we going to deal with that? So it's not non-political, but it's much less political, especially during the research itself. And generally the outcome of external evaluations are reports written very much in a think or academic language. Even if it's not academic language, it's definitely much more lateral language, I would almost say, much less practical. And then I thought to add here, of course, those are, if I look at it from the local practitioner level, that's the main things I'm dealing with: informal evaluations, external evaluations. And then we're very conscious that there's an entire existing body of knowledge out there aside from the evaluations that we do or order others to do. And there's the body of literature in academia. There's all kinds of knowledge that other cities or other practitioners might have, let alone other countries or knowledge networks such as RAN might have. And that's in a way characterized by the fact that it's very scattered. It takes a while to get to know where you can find specific knowledge. You don't know upfront whether it's going to be relevant to our daily practice or not. And the question is always, do you have someone in practice mandated, in my team, for example, to browse through that or to find the relevant pieces in that scattered body of knowledge or not? And very often I'm afraid to say the answer is no. That's often not part of anyone's job description. Next slide. So that brings me to some of the suggestions or conclusions, you could say. I very much liked the presentations that you gave, Paolo and Julian, especially when it came to, for example, your storytelling solution, Paolo, but also I noted some words. You talked about participatory designs, Julian, and especially also that second best but realistic option when it comes to how much time do you have on the practice level and how do you create oral exchanges. Basically, there's 2 ways from which you can approach this, I think. On the one hand, I think I made the case for why I think practitioners are often evaluators, but not formal ones. So on the one hand, we asked ourselves, what does that mean for the practitioner level? So on the left side, I think what we need to do is train professionals to be evaluators to a much larger extent than is currently the case, which has something to do with how do you formalize that internal evaluation that's going on, but it also has to do with a specific mindset, with goal setting, with an idea of what quality management even is and how you track progress and how you identify barriers and so on. It also, I think, another suggestion related to that external body of knowledge that is already out there, aside from internal and external evaluation. I think it's very important to mandate individuals to focus on that existing body of knowledge. So to make that part of someone's job description and to basically feed them with very specific questions from other practitioners, and to also let them engage with external networks that sometimes already bring that knowledge together for us. And finally, I think professionals to a much larger extent should be included in the research design. Right now, I realize that very often it's only the management level that will engage in contracts and in external formal evaluations in determining what they should look like. And I think it's very important to bring the practitioners who are doing that work in practice already into the research design phase, even before maybe the research formally starts or is contracted out. Second, when you focus on the external level, so on academia or other professionals doing a lot of evaluations but not being practitioners, I would really like to make a case for much more ethnographic research, basically meaning, well, you could say the participatory design, where rather than coming in maybe once or twice over a couple of months' time or only once to interview one individual, I think it would be much more worthwhile to really do ethnographic research and basically walk along with practitioners, and as you go along, identify what research questions should be and what you see in practice. Second, I think academics, and well, I'm still an academic myself, that's my background, and I moved from academia to practice 2 years ago, but I'm still also working at Leiden University as an academic. Now working on the practitioner level and seeing how political that level often is, I think that makes it very clear that academics need to be trained much more, not so much to be more political, but to address that political side of the evaluations that they do. So how do you incorporate it, and how do you also, it includes a bit the next suggestion. You need to include the upper levels already in the research design as well. So very often it might be a team like mine that contracts out specific research, but if we do not include the management level ourselves or the political level, they're going to be very worried by the time a report comes out, especially if it has some maybe damaging conclusions in it. And that's very often the case. And I found that a lot can be prevented on the political level already if those upper levels have been included at the start of a research already, and if academics are also trained on how to discuss what they're going to be doing, how to present, and how to soften any concerns there might be on the political level at the start of a research. And finally, again, very much coming from my own experience as a researcher as well, I'm very conscious that for researchers, in the end, there's always very much a focus on paper, not just on the paper that comes out of an evaluation, so being able to publish it and stamp your name on it, also to kind of say, hey, I'm an expert on this topic, I'm doing M&E, but also very much on scientific and academic article writing, which I think is very worthwhile for the academic body of knowledge, but it's such a remote world for practitioners. So I think there should be much more of a focus from paper to practice on the academic level when it comes to thinking about what is the end product of an evaluation. And I would almost say it shouldn't be a report, it should be something else, whether it's oral presentations, whether it's discussions, whether it's storytelling designs. And if you have a paper, that's more something that the researcher can use for their own benefit, whether it be publishing an academic article or just, making sure that the knowledge can be shared. But I think we still together, and especially from the academic side, have a very large focus on putting it on paper and then basically saying, well, that was that, thank you very much. So that's it. And if there's any questions, feel free to reach out, but I think we have some Q&A opportunities here right now as well.
Yeah, please. Thank you, Lisbeth, for your excellent presentation on you're bridging the gap yourself, right, between the two roles of being an academic and a practitioner, and being also a practitioner. So I think let's dive into the discussion between the three of you. And also, please, people still use the Q&A function if you have any questions to the panel. But I'm really curious to hear from Julian and or Paolo about your ideas on how to train practitioners, professionals to be kind of also a researcher and otherwise. So Julian, if you like, please respond to this idea.
First of all, I'm very sympathetic to all of these ideas Lisbeth just outlined. Just because what I realize is, while I'm really an academic, most of those I was dealing with in the practitioner side are as well versed in both worlds as you were. So therefore I said, not without any reason, we beforehand in our presentation so often, because what we learned while developing evaluation designs together, it is really, really important that these dichotomies, while they exist to some degree, they have their limits. So we were once asked what could be in our studies that did international comparisons, what can be structures that do these knowledge bases and knowledge managements right. And I think that is a key thing of having revolving doors to some degree, not only in terms of positions, but just in terms of knowledge and positions within a project and so on. And I think there are a couple of years, I think we could work much more with funding fellowships and secondments, not only within practice, but within those who commission evaluations, with those who do evaluations. So that is, I think, really, really important. I think you can set up the structures in that way. And I think what RAN is doing, basically, we would need more RANs and we would need them on the national levels too. And I think the strategy of the European Union now to think strategically about these knowledge hubs, I think you can do them perfectly right. You can do them overly bureaucratic, you can do them centralized, but you can do them as well good, pluralistic, with a lot of exchanges and dialogues. And I think there's a lot of music there that we need to now, I don't know, help that they are steered rightly, I think.
Thank you. Paolo, yes?
Yes, I would like to, I like the ideas that Lisbeth showed us. And I think that one way of looking at it is that sometimes external evaluation just uses practitioners as data sources, as key informants, and they don't really involve people in the design process and the discussion and reflection processes on external evaluations. And this is doable, and I think that the best evaluations come from this dialogue, and this is the most practical way to create on people that are not evaluators by training, or that are not worried about evaluation in their day-to-day activities as such, to develop the most important tool in an evaluator's toolbox, that is evaluative reasoning. And I think that this is something that you can train, and this is something that you can develop and get better at. And also, I think that another very interesting idea, and I would advocate for that as well, is that we have to formalize a little bit the internal evaluations, because so many interesting and valuable information gets lost because you don't formalize it in a way. And it's reflection at different levels, because like Lisbeth said, day-to-day activities tend us to put our focus, and correctly so, on people, on individuals. And external evaluation look at the system in a much more simplified way, as it looks at people as a group that shares certain challenges or a certain situation, and it doesn't look at them as in their specificity. So I think it's important, both things. So external evaluations should be less external in the usual way of doing it, and they should be more involving with the key stakeholders in all process phases, and not only as look at people as data sources, and also to formalize some kind of some formalization of the internal reflections that are taking place on a day-to-day basis.
Super, thank you for this reflection, Paolo. There's a question for you, Lisbeth, in the chat. There are quite many risk assessment tools, and those tools are being developed for the field, VRA2, etc. Mainly they are used by prison and police. And what is your opinion on these tools and using them more widely within the PCVE field, including by case managers, also from municipal workers, etc.?
Yeah, well, thanks, Heidi, for that question. Well, in a way, it's funny that you mentioned risk assessment now, because I thought of it earlier during this presentation, during Julian's presentation, especially when it came to pragmatism and, well, the difficulties in indicators and the sheer number that is often, the sheer number of indicators and the time they require. When it comes to risk assessments, because that's my personal experience with the risk assessment, I'm trained as a VERA 2 risk assessor and another one called SQAT. And I've written a paper on specific risk assessment tools, comparing a number of them to see what are the main, well, there's a lot of overlap, obviously, what are the differences and how do they work in practice. And one of the main conclusions of me and my co-authors was that it's very worthwhile, but it's very difficult to do it right, to determine at the start what risk are we even talking about, because it differs quite a bit whether you ask a police officer what he means by risk or a case manager, because they all work with a different purpose generally. And second, if you do it, it needs to be a continuous endeavor. So there's not much use other than determining what do we know at this point in time about this specific individual and what do we still need to find out. That's useful to do at the start when you start dealing with an individual. But ideally, you use risk assessment to do that again in maybe 2-3 months' time. And again, even if you do it only once every 6 months, because risk changes, it's dynamic. But we found in the research that we did on the reintegration process in the Netherlands that, for example, probationers simply did not have access to all information needed to do it properly. And it cost them a lot of time to do one risk assessment on one individual. Same applies to the police. So on the one hand, doing risk assessment, I've always argued you should really realize that that's quite a specific skill to do it properly. So it's very necessary to do it, but it's best done by just a small group of individuals who are very well trained to do it, who have access to the information and who can do it again over time. At the same time, it's very valuable also for the discussion we're having here, because most risk assessment tools in violent extremism are structured professional judgment tools, SPJ tools, including the VERA, for example. And they are very much nothing other than bringing information together in a structured way, often by professionals. So in a way, risk assessment could very much bridge that gap, be a form of bridging the gap. Paulo was just saying we should formalize what individuals do internally in practice a bit more. And I agree with that. And risk assessment tools could provide a way of doing that in a structured way. So yeah, a bit of a neither here nor there answer maybe, but basically I'm saying it requires expertise to do it well. And it's not as simple as going out, doing one training on a risk assessment tool and then saying good luck. You really need to integrate that into the work process. But at the same time, it can be very worthwhile if you implement it in the proper way.
Okay. Thank you, Elizabeth. Julian, you also want to respond?
I want to say the same things, but add one point. But who could better navigate us? Because Lisbeth didn't write you, Lisbeth, the work, the guide to the complex galaxy or something like that, practitioner's guide. So
yeah,
you are
to the galaxy. That's the...
yeah, that's something like that. I remember. So it's a good work. So I recommend it to everyone. But in any case, apart from the fact that it needs training and it's not easy to integrate, but it's worthwhile, there are a couple of more problems, I think, and I think you alluded to that we have often multi-professional settings with a lot of backgrounds, especially when we cooperate between civil society and security agencies. And those instruments, all of them, do not fit these settings to some degree. The language is different, the diagnostics are different behind that, and therefore what we saw in Germany, there are a lot of tools used. So we suggested now to the Federal Ministry of Education and Research another project simply to develop with practitioners in these cooperative settings assess those risk assessment tools and develop something within these cooperative settings to make it more feasible for this multi-professional setting. So just to add another limit, but I underline every opportunity and chances that are within Vera 2, Rada ITE, and how they are called. Right? There's so many, TRAP 18 and others.
Okay, thank you, Julian. I'm also looking at the clock. We only have some minutes left, and we start a little bit late, but I still want to finish on time. It's getting a little bit darker here. So maybe just for you, Julian, one other thing to reflect on, the idea from Lisbeth to also incorporate the political aspects more from the researcher side. So you could have the practitioners being some more research-like, but you could also ask these researchers to have also the perspective of these political tensions that are going around in these in this field. What is your take on this?
I'm a political scientist and I come from international relations, so I'm very sympathetic to that argument because I'm interested in these political conditions. No, with all seriousness, when we did our survey with practitioners and evaluators in this field, I think that was clear that this has an impact on every evaluation, quality management, and implementation setting. And we have a tendency that some researchers that are well versed in evaluation methods are really method guys, and so it is to have the political component in the picture requires some feeling for the field, some experiences in the field. You can gain them as a researcher, but I think all practitioners were always worried when we approached them wanted to research, not again, and should we train you now again? So we had this experience, and this all points to the fact that there might not be a context sensitivity, both internal and external. And I think it is really, really important to understand the governance and the political communication context of both your evaluation work and the PVE measure you're dealing with. And but how to train that is very difficult because these are changing subjects. So I just can say, be sensitive for that. And secondly, be very modest in your approach to these projects because there's a lot of expertise, and learn yourself before going into these evaluation positions immediately.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you all, the three of you, for your excellent presentations and your discussion amongst each other, and also with the questions coming from the Q&A. For wrapping up, I would like to give the floor to Esther. You're still muted, Esther. Yeah, there you go. You're unmuted.
Oh, yes, you. Sorry. Rid of it. Yes, thanks everyone for listening, and thank you all speakers for your interesting presentations. In order for us to keep improving, we would like to ask you to fill in the survey. You will automatically lead to the survey after the webinar. You will see the image that you see on your left external side, and then if you press continue, you will go automatically to the survey, or you can scan the QR code on the right side. And the edited recording of the webinar will be published via the RAN website and YouTube channel. Thank you. And
yeah, thank you all. We'll close the session now. See you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. See you later. Bye.